Baltimore, 1889. A nurse stood in the operating theater with hands so destroyed by chemicals that she could barely grip a scalpel. She was about to resign from the job she loved when a brilliant surgeon made her an unusual offer. "Let me take plaster casts of your ruined hands." What happened next? Saved 1.8 billion lives, changed surgery forever, and was almost completely forgotten. The solution was so simple it seemed impossible, but the woman behind it would vanish from history while her invention became invisible through its own success. How did one nurse's damaged hands become the key to modern medicine, and why don't we know her name? Baltimore, Maryland. October 1889. The operating theater at Johns Hopkins Hospital smelled like death fighting against carbolic acid and losing. Caroline Hampton stood at the instrument table, her hands submerged in a basin of mercuric chloride solution, watching the skin on her fingers turn the color of raw meat. The chemical burned like liquid fire, but she kept her face perfectly still, perfectly professional, because that's what nurses did. They endured. Dr. William Halstead, the hospital's brilliant new chief of surgery, was preparing for another operation, and Caroline was his head operating room nurse, which meant her hands had to be sterile no matter what it cost her. She pulled her hands from the solution and reached for the towel, every nerve ending screaming. The skin on her palms was cracked and weeping, the dermatitis spreading up her wrists like some kind of plague. This was the third time today she'd scrubbed with the poisonous compounds, the price of modern antiseptic surgery that was supposed to save lives by killing every germ that dared approach the operating table. Dr. Halstead had embraced Joseph Lister's theories about germs with the fervor of a convert, demanding that every surface, every instrument, every hand be bathed in chemicals that could strip paint from walls. The old surgeons called him obsessive. Caroline called him right. She'd seen too many patients die from infections that started in operating rooms where surgeons worked in their street clothes, wiping their hands on their aprons between procedures. Dr. Halstead's methods were brutal, but they were. Patients survived operations that would have killed them in any other hospital. The death rate from infection had dropped by half since he'd implemented his protocols. All it cost was the hands of every nurse who worked for him. "Miss Hampton," Dr. Halstead said, his voice cutting through her thoughts. "Are you prepared?" She turned to face him, hiding her hands in the folds of her uniform. "Yes, doctor." But she wasn't prepared, not anymore. Every day the pain got worse. Every night she lay in her room at the nurse's residence, her hands throbbing, unable to sleep, unable to do anything but stare at the ceiling and wonder how much longer she could endure this. She'd tried everything. She'd wrapped her hands in collodion, a thick liquid that dried into a protective film, but it cracked when she flexed her fingers, and pieces of it fell into the surgical field. She'd tried wearing cotton gloves under the chemical wash, but they disintegrated after 2 minutes. She'd tried shorter scrubs, less thorough disinfection, and Dr. Halstead had looked at her with those intense eyes and asked if she wanted to be responsible for killing a patient. So she went back to the full protocol, and her hands continued to fall apart. The patient was wheeled in, a middle-aged man with an abdominal tumor that needed to be removed. Dr. Halstead approached the operating table with the confidence of a man who believed he could cut disease out of the human body and sew it back up again better than God had made it. Caroline handed him instruments with hands that felt like they were on fire, every touch of metal against her raw skin another small torture. She watched the surgery proceed with the precision of a Swiss watch, Dr. Halstead's hands moving with absolute certainty, making incisions that other surgeons wouldn't dare attempt. This was why she stayed. This was why she endured, because Halstead was revolutionizing surgery, and she was part of that revolution, even if it was destroying her from the fingertips inward. 2 hours later, the operation was complete. The patient's abdomen was sewn shut with sutures, so fine they were almost invisible. Dr. Halstead stepped back from the table, satisfaction evident in his bearing. "Excellent work, Miss Hampton," he said. "As always." She nodded, unable to speak, because if she opened her mouth she might scream. Her hands were worse than ever, the chemicals having eaten through skin that was already raw, exposing pink flesh that had no business being visible. She made it through the post-operative cleaning, made it through the sterilization of the instruments, made it all the way to the nurse's station before she finally let herself look at her hands. They were a disaster, cracked, bleeding, the skin peeling away and stripped. She could barely bend her fingers. By tomorrow morning, she knew, they'd be too swollen to work. She'd been fighting this battle for 3 months, trying to find a way to keep doing her job without destroying herself in the process. But she was losing. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She couldn't do this anymore. She'd thought she was strong enough, dedicated enough, professional enough to endure any hardship for the sake of medicine, but she'd been wrong. The chemicals were winning. Her hands were ruined. She was Caroline Hampton, chief operating room nurse, the woman Dr. Halstead called unusually efficient, was going to have to resign. She thought of her family back in South Carolina, the aunts who'd raised her after the war, who'd been horrified when she'd announced she was leaving to become a nurse instead of marrying a plantation owner like a proper Southern lady should. They'd told her nursing was beneath her station, that she was throwing away her breeding and education to empty bedpans and wash the bodies of strangers. She'd proven them wrong. She'd graduated from nursing school in New York. She'd secured a position at the most prestigious new hospital in America. She'd worked beside one of the greatest surgeons in the world, and now she was going to have to quit because of a skin condition. The humiliation was almost worse than the pain. Almost. She wrapped her hands in clean bandages and walked to Dr. Halstead's office. He was there, writing up notes from the day's surgeries, his desk covered in papers and medical journals. He looked up when she knocked, and something in her expression made him set down his pen. "Miss Hampton, what can I do for you?" She took a breath. "Dr. Halstead, I need to inform you that I will be tendering my resignation, effective immediately." The words came out steady, professional, giving no hint of the desperation churning inside her. Dr. Halstead stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Resignation? That's absurd. You're the best operating room nurse I've ever worked with. What could possibly justify?" He stopped mid-sentence as she unwrapped her hands and held them out for his inspection. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush stone. Dr. Halstead stared at her ruined hands with the intensity he usually reserved for examining tumors. "How long has it been this bad?" 3 months, sir. Getting progressively worse. And you said nothing." His voice was sharp with something that might have been anger or might have been guilt. "I attempted various remedies. None were effective. The mercuric chloride and carbolic acid are simply too caustic for my constitution." She kept her tone clinical, detached, as if she were discussing a patient's symptoms rather than her own impending unemployment. "I apologize for the inconvenience this will cause." Dr. Halstead walked around his desk and took her hands in his, studying them with a surgeon's precision. His touch was gentle, but even gentle hurt. "This is unacceptable," he said finally. "I will not lose my best nurse to a fixable problem. With respect, sir, I don't believe this problem is fixable. I've tried everything." "You've tried everything you know," he corrected. "I am going to find a solution. You will not resign. Give me 1 week." It wasn't a request, it was an order, delivered with the absolute confidence of a man who believed he could solve any problem if he just applied enough intelligence to it. The Smithsonian Museum of American History acquired Caroline Hampton's original pair of rubber surgical gloves in 1968, purchased from the Halstead family estate, for a sum that would have shocked Caroline had she lived to see it. The gloves sit now in a climate-controlled display case, the rubber deteriorated and fragile, surrounded by explanatory text that tells visitors about their history and impact. Most museum visitors walk past the display without stopping. Why would they? They're just old gloves, yellowed and cracked, not particularly interesting compared to the dramatic artifacts in neighboring cases. But occasionally someone stops, reads the placard, understands what they're looking at, and experiences that peculiar moment of connection across time, when you realize that history isn't just dates and events, but actual people facing actual problems who found solutions that still affect your life today. A middle-aged woman stops at the display one afternoon, reading about Caroline's dermatitis and William's determination to find a solution. She's recovering from surgery herself, a procedure to remove a cancerous tumor that would have killed her 50 years ago. She survived because modern surgical techniques include comprehensive infection control, antiseptic protocols, and yes, the universal use of surgical gloves that prevent post-operative complications. She stands there looking at these ancient deteriorated gloves and realizes that her survival can be traced back in part to one nurse's damaged hands in 1889. The connection is tenuous but real. Without Caroline's problem and William's solution, surgery might have developed differently, more slowly, with higher infection rates persisting longer into the modern era. The woman might still have had her surgery, but her chances of surviving it would have been measurably low. She takes a photo of the display to show her daughter, wanting to share this unexpected moment of historical connection, wanting to say, "Look, this is why I'm still alive. This is how random and beautiful and interconnected everything is." Across town from the museum at Georgetown University Medical Center, a first-year medical student named Marcus Chen is pulling on surgical gloves for the first time as part of his Introduction to Clinical Skills course. The instructor, a surgeon with 30 years of experience, demonstrates proper gloving technique. Hold the glove at the cuff, slide your hand in smoothly, adjust the fit, ensure no contamination of the sterile exterior surface. Marcus follows the instructions carefully, aware that he's learning skills that will define his career. The gloves feel strange at first, an extra layer between him and the world, but the instructor assures him that within a few weeks they'll feel natural, that he'll stop noticing them except as part of the background infrastructure of medicine. Marcus has read about the history of surgical gloves in his medical humanities course, knows about Caroline Hampton and Joseph Bloodgood, and the data that proved gloves saved lives, but the intellectual knowledge doesn't quite connect to the physical sensation of latex against his skin, to the strange feeling of separation and protection that the gloves provide. It will take time for him to understand viscerally what he knows intellectually, that these simple barriers are one of the most important safety innovations in medical history. In Manila, a surgical nurse named Rosa Delgado works through a 12-hour shift in an overcrowded public hospital, treating patients who can't afford private care, dealing with conditions that would shock physicians in wealthy countries. The hospital is understaffed, undersupplied, constantly on the edge of crisis, but they have surgical gloves, not the expensive nitrile gloves that American hospitals use, but basic rubber gloves that provide adequate protection. Rosa changes gloves between every patient, maintains sterile technique even when exhausted, knows that this simple barrier is often the difference between a patient surviving or developing a post-operative infection that the hospital can't afford to treat. She's never heard of Caroline Hampton, doesn't know the history of the equipment she uses every day, but she's living proof that innovations ripple outward across time and space, that solutions developed in Baltimore in 1889 still save lives in Manila. In rural Uganda, a medical NGO runs a surgical clinic that performs operations on patients who would otherwise have no access to medical care. The clinic has minimal equipment, operates on a shoestring budget, struggles with power outages and supply chain issues, but they have surgical gloves, shipped in bulk by international donors, stored carefully to prevent deterioration in the heat. A surgeon named Dr. Emmanuel Okello performs a cesarean section wearing gloves that cost less than $1 per pair, using them to maintain sterile conditions in an environment that is anything but sterile. The mother and baby both survive, both go home healthy, both continue living in part because a piece of equipment exists that prevents infection, that makes surgery possible even in places where advanced medical infrastructure doesn't exist. The cascade continues, the ripples spread. Every surgical glove pulled on in every operating theater worldwide is part of a lineage that stretches back to Caroline Hampton's damaged hands. The technology has improved dramatically. Modern gloves are better fitting, more durable, less likely to cause allergic reactions than the early rubber version. But the fundamental concept remains unchanged. Create a barrier between the surgical team and the patient, maintain sterility, prevent infection. It's such a simple idea that it seems obvious in retrospect, but all revolutionary ideas seem obvious once they've been implemented. In 2019, a meta-analysis of surgical outcomes data estimated that proper use of surgical gloves, combined with comprehensive infection control protocols, had saved approximately 1.8 billion lives since the practice became universal in the early 90s. The number was so large that it bordered on meaningless, a statistic too vast to comprehend on a human scale. But behind every single digit in that enormous number was a person, someone who survived surgery who would have died from infection a century earlier, someone whose life continued, who had children, who contributed to the world, who experienced joy and love, and all the complicated beauty of human existence, because they didn't die from a post-operative infection. Caroline Hampton never knew about most of those lives, never knew that her desperate need for a solution to her damaged hands would cascade forward through generations, saving people who wouldn't be born for a century after her death. She'd just wanted her hands to stop hurting. She just wanted to keep doing work she loved. The fact that her personal problem became a global solution was almost accidental, the result of being the right person with the right problem at the right moment with access to the right resources. But maybe that's how most important innovations happen, not through grand visions of changing the world, but through small problems that demand solutions, through personal suffering that refuses to be accepted as inevitable, through determination to find better ways of doing things, even when everyone says nothing can be done. Caroline's legacy isn't preserved in museums or medical textbooks, though it appears in both. Her legacy lives in every operating theater in the museums or medical textbooks, though it appears in both. Her legacy lives in every operating theater in the world, in every pair of surgical gloves pulled on by doctors and nurses who never think about where those gloves came from or why they exist. Her legacy lives in the countless people walking around today who owe their survival to innovations they don't know about, to solutions developed by people whose names they've never heard. The invisibility is fitting. Caroline never wanted recognition. She just wanted to do her work without pain, wanted to help patients without destroying herself in the process. That her solution to a personal problem ended up saving billions of lives was never her goal, but it became her gift to the future, a gift that keeps giving, every single day, in operating rooms around the world, and somewhere in the endless cascade of cause and effect that defines human history. Her damaged hands, and William's refusal to accept defeat, created ripples that will continue spreading forward through time, saving lives that haven't been born yet, making possible futures that we can't imagine, all because one nurse refused to quit, and one surgeon refused to accept that nothing could be done. That's the real story of the rubber surgical glove, not just an invention or an innovation, but a testament to what becomes possible when personal suffering meets determination, meets resources, meets timing, meets the willingness to believe that better solutions exist, if we're brave enough to look for them. Caroline Hampton died in 1922, but her impact continues unabated, invisible but essential, saving lives every single day, in ways she never imagined, and probably wouldn't have believed if someone had told her. She was just a nurse with damaged hands, who needed a solution. She became, accidentally and without intending it, one of the most important figures in the history of modern medicine. The gloves remember, even if we forget. 1 week. Caroline gave him 1 week, though she didn't believe anything would come of it. She'd researched the problem herself, had consulted with other nurses, had even written to former instructors from nursing school. The consensus was universal. If you couldn't tolerate the antiseptic solutions, you couldn't work in a modern operating theatre. It was that simple. But Dr. Halstead was not a man who accepted simple fans. For the next 3 days, Caroline watched him approach the problem with the same methodical intensity he brought to surgical cases. He consulted chemistry textbooks. He experimented with different dilutions of the antiseptic solutions, trying to find a concentration that would kill germs without destroying skin. He tested barrier creams and ointments, coating her hands in substances that ranged from merely useless to actively disgusting. Nothing worked. The chemicals were too strong, and her skin was too damaged. On the 4th day, he changed tactics entirely. He called Caroline to his office during the lunch hour, and she found him sitting at his desk with a strange collection of materials spread before him: plaster of Paris, bandaged basin of water, a measuring tape. "Sit down, Miss Hampton," he said. She sat, confused, watching as he rolled up his sleeves and began preparing the plaster with the efficiency of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before. "What are you doing?" she asked. "I'm taking casts of your hands," he said, as if this explained everything. When she continued to stare at him blankly, he elaborated. "If your skin cannot tolerate the chemicals, then we must create a barrier between your skin and the chemical. A thin, flexible barrier that will not interfere with surgical precision. I believe such a barrier is possible, but it must be custom-fitted to your hands, or it will be worse than useless." Understanding dawned slowly. "You're going to make gloves, not me. I'm going to send the specifications to people who know what they're doing. The Goodyear Rubber Company in New York manufactures rubber products for industrial use. I believe they can create something suitable for medical purposes." He gestured to her damaged hand. "Please place your right hand flat on the desk, palm down." Caroline did as instructed, feeling foolish. Dr. Halstead worked with surprising gentleness, wrapping her hand in bandage soaked in plaster, building up layers until her hand looked like it belonged to a mummy. The plaster was cold and wet, and she could feel it hardening against her skin, capturing every line, every contour. "This won't work," she said. "Rubber will be too thick, too clumsy. I need to feel the instruments, need to know if I'm gripping them correctly." "The rubber will be thin," Halstead assured her. "I'll specify that in my letter, thin enough for sensitivity, thick enough for protection." He finished the right hand and started on the left. His focus absolute. Caroline watched his face as he worked, seeing something there that made her chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with anticipation of gloves. Dr. William Halstead was one of the most brilliant surgeons in America. He had trained in Europe under the greatest physicians of the era. He had patients begging for his services, medical students fighting for positions in his operating theater. He could have anyone as his head nurse, but he was spending his lunch hour making plaster casts of her hands, because he didn't want to lose her. The realization was dizzying. "Why are you doing this?" she asked quietly. He didn't look up from his work. "Because you are an exceptionally competent nurse, Miss Hampton. I cannot afford to lose you. There are other competent nurses, not like you." Now he did look up, and his eyes held something that went beyond professional respect. "Not like you." The moment stretched between them, heavy with things that couldn't be said in a professional setting, until finally Dr. Halstead broke eye contact and returned his attention to the plaster cast. 20 minutes later, both hands were encased in hardening plaster. Caroline sat at his desk feeling absurd, unable to do anything but wait for the casts to set. Dr. Halstead paced his office, already composing the letter to Goodyear in his head, muttering about specifications and materials. "The rubber must be vulcanized for flexibility," he said, "and it should extend past the wrist, perhaps 6 inches up the forearm, to protect against splashes. Do you agree, Miss Hampton?" She looked at her mummified hands. "I think you've gone insane, Dr. Halstead." "Very probably," he agreed, and there was humor in his voice that she'd never heard before. "But indulge my insanity for another few days. If this works, it will solve your problem. If it doesn't, you can resign with my blessing, though I will fight it until my last breath." The plaster had fully hardened. Dr. Halstead used a medical saw to carefully cut the casts free, creating perfect negative molds of Caroline's hand. He packed them in a wooden box with more care than most people would give to precious jewels, then sat down to write his letter to the Goodyear Company. Caroline watched him work, this strange, intense man, who had just spent an hour of his valuable time trying to solve the problem of one nurse's damaged hands. "Why?" she asked again, needing to understand. He looked at her over the top of his writing desk. "Because medicine is changing, Miss Hampton. We're on the edge of something revolutionary. A future where surgery doesn't have to mean death from infection, where we can cut into the human body and expect our patients to survive. But that future requires absolute attention to antisepsis, to sterilization, to protocols that are frankly brutal to the people implementing them. If we can't find a way to protect the people doing this work, we'll never achieve what we're capable of achieving. Your hands are not just your problem. They're a symptom of a larger issue that will only get worse as we demand more stringent antiseptic practices." He returned to his letter. "Also, I would miss working with you. You anticipate my needs in surgery before I voice them. You maintain absolute focus, even during procedures that would make lesser people faint. You are, in short, irreplaceable. So yes, I'm willing to go to some absurd lengths to keep you." Caroline felt her throat tight. She'd spent her entire professional life being told to be grateful for opportunities, to accept hardship as the price of admission to a male-dominated field. No one had ever suggested that she might be worth some effort to keep. "Thank you," she said quietly. Dr. Halstead sealed the letter, and the box containing the plaster casts. "Don't thank me yet. This may not work. The Goodyear Company may tell me I'm insane. The gloves, if they create them, may be completely impractical for surgical use, but we have to try. Medicine progresses when we try things that seem insane." He stood and offered her a slight bow. "Now go rest your hands. I'll send this via express post today. We should have a response within 10 days. Caroline left his office with her hands freshly bandaged, her resignation letter unsubmitted, and a fragile hope growing in her chest that maybe, just maybe, there was a solution to problems that everyone else called unsolvable. She didn't know then that those plaster casts would change the course of surgical history.
She didn't know that the gloves would save millions of lives over the next century. She didn't know that she and Dr. Halstead would fall in love, marry, and spend their lives together advancing the cause of medicine. All she knew was that someone had cared enough to try to help her, and sometimes that was enough.
12 days after Dr. Halstead shipped the plaster casts to New York, a package arrived at Johns Hopkins Hospital, addressed to Caroline Hampton in care of Dr. William Halstead. It was a Wednesday afternoon, and Caroline was in the middle of preparing instruments for an appendectomy when one of the orderlies brought it to the operating theatre. The package was larger than she'd expected, wrapped in brown paper and tied with string, with the Goodyear Rubber Company's label prominent on the outside. Her hands, which had been resting in the brief period before Dr. Halstead's arrival, started to throb as if they knew their fate was sealed in that parcel. "Well," Dr. Halstead said, appearing in the doorway with impeccable timing. "Open." Caroline set down the scalpel she'd been sterilizing and approached the package with the caution of someone defusing a bomb. She cut the string and carefully unwrapped the brown paper, revealing a wooden box. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, were 2 pairs of gloves. They were nothing like the heavy rubber gloves she'd seen workers wearing in factories. These were thin, almost delicate, with a slight texture to the surface. They were pale amber in color, and when she lifted one from the box, it felt impossibly light. The rubber had been molded exactly to the shape of her hands, following every curve captured by the plaster casts. There was a letter in the box as well, which Dr. Halstead retrieved and read aloud. "Dr. Halstead, per your specifications, we have manufactured 2 pairs of thin rubber gloves, using vulcanized rubber. The material is flexible and should provide adequate sensitivity, while protecting against chemical exposure. The texture has been intentionally added to prevent slippage when handling wet instruments. We have included extended cuffs as requested. If these prove satisfactory, we can manufacture additional pairs. Yours, Thomas R. Murphy, Manufacturing Director, Goodyear Rubber Company." Dr. Halstead looked at her with barely contained excitement. "Try them on." Caroline pulled on the right glove. First, it slid over her bandaged hand with surprising ease, the rubber thin enough that she could feel the texture of the bandages beneath. The fit was perfect, custom made to her exact dimensions. She flexed her fingers experimentally. The rubber moved with her, offering resistance but not restriction. She added the left glove, then stood there feeling completely ridiculous, staring at her hands as if they belonged to someone else. "Pick up that scalpel," Dr. Halstead ordered. She did. The textured rubber gripped the steel handle securely, and she could feel the weight and balance of the instrument through the thin material. It wasn't the same as working with bare hands, but it was close enough to work with, close enough to maybe, possibly, allow her to keep doing her job. "The appendectomy," Dr. Halstead said. "We're doing it now, with the gloves." Caroline looked at him in shock. "You can't be serious." "We haven't tested them, haven't verified they can withstand the sterilization process, haven't." "The patient is waiting," Dr. Halstead interrupted. "We either proceed with confidence in this solution, or we proceed knowing that this is likely the last time you'll assist me in surgery. I prefer the former option. The gloves come off if they prove problematic. Until then, we work." He was insane, absolutely insane, and Caroline loved him for it. She spent the next 15 minutes testing the gloves against every challenge the operating theater could provide. She submerged them in the mercuric chloride solution, expecting them to dissolve or become brittle. They didn't. The rubber held up perfectly, and when she pulled her hands from the basin, there was no burning, no pain, just the strange sensation of wet rubber against bandaged skin. She scrubbed them with carbolic soap, the same way she'd scrub bare hands. The rubber remained intact. She picked up instruments, testing her grip on scalpels, forceps, needle holders. The texture worked exactly as promised, preventing slippage without interfering with dexterity. The patient was wheeled in, a factory worker with acute appendicitis, who was probably going to die if they didn't operate immediately. Dr. Halstead began the procedure with his usual confident precision, and Caroline fell into the familiar rhythm of surgical assistance. Hand him the scalp, adjust the retractors, suction the blood, anticipate his next move before he asks. The gloves were strange at first, an extra layer between her and the work, but within minutes she'd adjusted to the sensation.
The rubber was thin enough that she could feel the tension in the tissues as Dr. Halstead worked, could gauge the resistance in the instruments. More importantly, her hands didn't hurt. For the first time in 3 months, Caroline worked through an entire surgical procedure without pain, without the distraction of damaged skin screaming at her with every move. The freedom was intoxicating. She could focus entirely on the surgery, on supporting Dr. Halstead's work, on doing her job the way she'd been trained to do it. The appendectomy took 45 minutes. When it was complete, Dr. Halstead stepped back from the table and looked at Caroline over his surgical mask. "Well, they work," she said, and her voice cracked slightly on the words. "They actually work." Something passed between them then, a moment of shared triumph that had nothing to do with the successful removal of an inflamed appendix and everything to do with the solution to a problem that had seemed unsolvable. Halstead nodded once, satisfied, then turned to give post-operative instructions. Caroline removed the gloves carefully, half expecting them to fall apart. Now that the surgery was complete, they didn't. The rubber was intact, reusable, exactly what was needed. She cleaned them with antiseptic solution and hung them to dry, then unwrapped her hands to inspect the damage beneath the bandages. The skin was still raw, still healing from 3 months of chemical exposure, but it hadn't gotten worse. The gloves had protected her completely. Word spread through the hospital with the speed of gossip in a small town. By the end of the day, 3 other nurses had come to the operating theatre to examine the gloves, to test them, to ask Dr. Halstead if they could have pairs made for themselves. He agreed immediately, taking measurements and preparing to send another order to Goodyear. Within a week, half the nurses in the operating theatre were wearing rubber gloves, and the reports were universally positive: fewer skin reactions, better instrument grip, no loss of surgical precision. One of Dr. Halstead's surgical residents, a young physician named Joseph Bloodgood, began wearing gloves as well, claiming they made suturing easier. Then another resident tried them, then another. The revolution happened slowly, then all at once.
Dr. Joseph Colt Bloodgood was a meticulous man who believed that medicine should be governed by data rather than tradition. When he started wearing rubber gloves during surgery in 1896, 7 years after Caroline Hampton's invention had arrived at Johns Hopkins, he did so with the intention of proving whether they actually made any measurable difference to patient outcomes. The prevailing wisdom among older surgeons was that gloves were unnecessary, a crutch for physicians who lacked the proper touch and sensitivity for surgical work. Some went further, claiming that gloves were actively dangerous, that they reduced a surgeon's ability to detect subtle differences in tissue that could mean the difference between life and death. Dr. Bloodgood, these arguments were nonsense, but suspicion wasn't proof, so he began collecting data. Every hernia operation he performed, every appendectomy, every surgical case that came through his operating theatre, he recorded in meticulous detail: date of surgery, patient information, surgical technique, whether gloves were used, and most importantly, whether the patient developed a post-operative infection. The results took 3 years to compile: 450 hernia operations, half performed with gloves, half without, all using the same antiseptic protocols, the same surgical techniques, the same post-operative care. The only variable was the gloves. When Dr. Bloodgood finally published his findings in 1899, the numbers were staggering. Operations performed without gloves had a post-operative infection rate of 17%. Nearly 1 in 5 patients developed infections that ranged from mild inflammation to deadly sepsis. Operations performed with gloves had an infection rate of less than 2%. The difference was so dramatic that it seemed impossible, so Bloodgood checked his data 3 times, then had a colleague verify his calculations. The numbers held. Rubber gloves reduced surgical infection rates by 88%. 88%. Dr. Halstead, who had been vindicated in his obsession with antisepsis, read Bloodgood's paper with the satisfaction of a man who'd been right all along. Caroline, who was no longer Caroline Hampton but Caroline Halstead, having married Dr. Halstead in 1890, shortly after the gloves arrived, read it with a different kind of satisfaction. That simple solution, born from her damaged hands and her husband's refusal to accept her resignation, had just been proven to save lives on a scale neither of them had imagined. The medical community's response was immediate and dramatic. Hospitals across America began ordering rubber gloves by the hundreds. Surgical supply companies started manufacturing them. Within 5 years, wearing gloves during surgery went from being an eccentric practice at one hospital to being standard procedure across the developed world. The old guard of surgeons who had performed operations with bare hands for their entire careers were forced to adapt or retire. A new generation of physicians emerged who couldn't imagine operating any other way. Caroline followed the revolution with quiet pride. She'd left nursing after marrying Dr. Halstead, as was required of married women in that era, but she maintained close friendships with the nurses who continued to work at Johns Hopkins. They told her stories about how the gloves had changed their work, how they no longer suffered from the chemical dermatitis that had nearly ended Caroline's career, how they could focus entirely on surgical assistance rather than managing their own pain. The impact extended beyond just protecting medical staff. As glove use became universal, surgeons began to notice other benefits. The textured rubber surface that had been added to help with instrument grip also provided better control when manipulating delicate tissue. Surgeons could work with wet, slippery organs without losing their grip. They could perform more precise dissections. Complication rates dropped across all types of surgery, but the real revolution came from an unexpected direction. With gloves protecting their hands, surgeons began to experiment with more aggressive antiseptic protocols. They could use stronger chemicals, scrub for longer periods, achieve higher levels of sterilization without worrying about destroying their skin. The germ theory of disease, which had been controversial when Caroline first started nursing, became accepted fact, and surgery entered a golden age of innovation. Operations that had been considered too dangerous became routine. Surgeons began opening abdomens, chests, even skulls, with confidence that their patients would survive the experience. The mortality rate from surgery plummeted. Hospitals transformed from houses of death into places where people could actually expect to be healed. And it all traced back to one nurse's damaged hands and one surgeon's refusal to accept that nothing could be done. Caroline kept the original pairs of gloves in a wooden box in her home. They were worn now, the rubber beginning to deteriorate after years of use, but she couldn't bring herself to throw them away. Sometimes when she was alone, she would take them out and hold them, remembering the desperation she'd felt the day she'd decided to resign, the hope that had flickered when Dr. Halstead had promised to find a solution, the vindication when Bloodgood's data proved that the solution had been right. Years later, a young medical student came to interview Dr. Halstead for a research paper on the history of surgical innovation. Dr. Halstead told the story of the gloves, of Caroline's dermatitis, of the plaster casts sent to Goodyear. The student asked why he'd gone to such lengths for one nurse. Dr. Halstead had looked at Caroline, who was sitting nearby reading a medical journal, and said simply, because she was worth it, and because the right person, in the right moment, with the right problem, can change everything. The student didn't understand then, but Caroline did. She'd lived. Her damaged hands had led to rubber gloves. Rubber gloves had led to safer surgery. Safer surgery had led to countless lives saved, innovations achieved, a medical revolution that continued to ripple outward through the year. Sometimes the smallest personal crisis could become the catalyst for transformation on a scale that no one could have predicted. The letter arrived at Caroline's home in Baltimore in the spring of 1918, nearly 30 years after the first pair of rubber gloves had been created for her hands. It was from a military surgeon named Captain Michael Stevens, stationed somewhere in France with the American Expeditionary Force. Caroline almost didn't open it, assuming it was another request for medical donations or volunteer work, but something about the handwriting made her pause. She broke the seal and read, "Mrs. Halstead, I am writing to thank you for saving my life, and the lives of countless soldiers under my care. I know you never served in the military, never saw a battlefield, never worked in a surgical tent while artillery shells exploded overhead, but your invention has made it possible for me to do work here that would have been impossible 20 years ago. The rubber gloves that you inspired allow me to operate in conditions that would have meant certain death for my patients in previous wars. I can maintain sterility even when working in mud and filth. I can perform surgeries that save lives instead of just amputating limbs. Yesterday I operated on a soldier with shrapnel in his abdomen. Without gloves, that surgery would have meant infection and death. With them, he has a chance. I wanted you to know that your legacy extends far beyond the operating theaters of peacetime hospitals. It reaches into the worst hell humanity can create, and it gives us a way to pull men back from death. Thank you for your damaged hands and your refusal to simply accept suffering. Thank you for demanding that someone find a solution. You have saved more lives than any general or president. Caroline read the letter 3 times, her vision blurring with tears she refused to let fall. William was in his study, working on a medical paper, and she brought the letter to him without speaking, just handed it over, and watched his face as he read. When he finished, he looked up at her with an expression that held 30 years of shared history, shared triumph, shared understanding that they had been part of something larger than themselves. You should frame this, he said quietly. No, Caroline replied. I should answer it. She wrote back to Captain Stevens that night, telling him that she'd done nothing extraordinary, that she'd simply been a nurse with a problem, and a surgeon willing to look for solutions. But even as she wrote the words, she knew they weren't entirely true. The gloves had been extraordinary. The impact had been extraordinary. The fact that a simple solution to one woman's skin condition had revolutionized surgery and was now saving soldiers' lives on distant battlefields was extraordinary. More letters came in the following months, from military physicians, field nurses, even soldiers who'd been saved by surgeries that wouldn't have been possible without sterile technique. Caroline kept them all in a folder that grew thicker every week. The Great War was a horror of unprecedented scale, but within that horror, medicine was advancing at an incredible pace. Field hospitals were performing complex surgeries in conditions that would have made previous generations of physicians throw up their hands in despair. Infection rates, while still terrible, were dramatically lower than in previous conflicts. Soldiers who would have died from simple wounds in the American Civil War were surviving injuries that would have killed men just decades earlier, and a significant part of that improvement came from the universal adoption of rubber gloves, allowing medical personnel to maintain antiseptic technique, even in the chaos of war. Caroline began corresponding with several military nurses, women who were working in conditions she could barely imagine. They described operating tents where the ground was mud, where blood soaked through canvas floors, where the wounded kept coming in waves that never seemed to end. In those conditions, rubber gloves were sometimes the only barrier between sterility and disaster. One nurse, a woman named Lieutenant Sarah Morrison, wrote about an incident where she'd had to assist in surgery while standing ankle-deep in water from a flooded river. The rubber gloves extended up her forearms had kept her hands clean and sterile even in conditions that were otherwise completely unsanitary. The surgeon had been able to complete a life-saving operation that would have been impossible without that protection. Your gloves are miracles, Lieutenant Morrison wrote. In a place where miracles are in short supply, they give us hope that maybe we can win against the darkness. William, reading over Caroline's shoulder, shook his head in wonder. We never imagined this. When I sent those plaster casts to Goodyear, I was trying to solve one problem, keep one excellent nurse from resigning. I never dreamed it would lead to this. Caroline folded the letter carefully. Neither did I. I just wanted my hands to stop hurting. They sat in silence for a moment, contemplating the strange paths that history took, how personal suffering could transform into global salvation, how a solution born from desperation could become standard practice that saved thousands of lives. The war ended in November 1918, and the letters gradually stopped coming, but the impact of those letters stayed with Caroline for the rest of her life. She'd spent years thinking of the rubber gloves as a personal victory, a solution to her own problem that happened to benefit other nurses. The war had shown her something different. It had shown her that small innovations, properly implemented, could cascade through systems in ways that changed the fundamental calculus of life and death. Military physicians returning from Europe brought with them stories of surgical advances achieved under impossible conditions. They'd performed operations in field hospitals that would have challenged surgeons in fully equipped civilian facilities. They'd saved men who should have died, and they universally credited rubber gloves as one of the essential tools that made that work possible. Captain Stevens came to visit after the war ended, showing up at Caroline's door in his uniform with a box under his arm. Inside the box were 12 pairs of rubber gloves, worn and stained, each pair labeled with the number of successful surgeries performed while wearing them.
"I wanted you to see these," he said. "I wanted you to know that your invention didn't just help nurses and surgeons, it helped the men we saved. Every pair here represents lives that continued, families that weren't destroyed, futures that weren't cut short." Caroline looked at the worn gloves, each one representing hours of desperate work, of battles fought against death in the mud, and chaos of war, and she finally understood the full magnitude of what had begun with her damaged hands and William's refusal to accept that nothing could be done. These weren't just gloves. They were life itself, given form in rubber.
By 1925, rubber surgical gloves had become so standard that an entire generation of medical students couldn't imagine surgery without them. Caroline, now in her 60s, occasionally visited Johns Hopkins to observe training sessions, watching young surgeons learn techniques that would have been impossible in her nursing days. The teaching had changed fundamentally. When Caroline had trained as a nurse in the 1880s, the emphasis had been on endurance, on the ability to withstand hardship without complaint. Nurses were expected to accept the damage that came from chemical antiseptics as the price of doing business. Now, the emphasis was on protection and prevention. Nursing students learned about rubber gloves in their first week of training, learned proper sterile technique, learned that protecting healthcare workers was just as important as protecting patients. Dr. Ballon Chesney, who had taken over much of the surgical teaching at Hopkins after William's retirement, made the history of rubber gloves part of his standard lecture series. Caroline attended one of these lectures at William's insistence, sitting in the back of the amphitheater, while Dr. Chesney held up a pair of modern surgical gloves and told the story of their invention. He got most of it right: the chemical dermatitis, the plaster casts, the first experimental surgery, but he left out the desperation, the pain, the moment when Caroline had genuinely believed her career was over. He left out the personal cost that had driven the innovation. After the lecture, several students approached Caroline, having recognized her from Dr. Chesney's introduction. They asked questions that revealed how much the world had changed. Did she really work without gloves for 3 months while her hands were destroyed? Why hadn't she just quit earlier? Couldn't she have worn regular cotton gloves? The questions came from a place of genuine incomprehension. These young people had grown up in a world where medical safety was assumed, where the idea of willingly subjecting yourself to chemicals that destroyed your skin seemed absurd. They couldn't imagine a time when there had been no alternative, when the choice had been between enduring damage or abandoning the profession entirely. Caroline tried to explain what medicine had been like in the 1880s, but she could see the confusion in their eyes. The past was a foreign country to them, a place where people did inexplicable things for inexplicable reasons. One young nursing student, a woman named Margaret, who reminded Caroline painfully of her younger self, asked the question that cut to the heart of everything. "Miss Wilted, if you could go back and avoid all that suffering, avoid the damaged hands, would you?" Caroline considered the question carefully. If she'd never developed dermatitis, she might never have needed the gloves. Without the gloves, surgery might have advanced more slowly. Without safer surgery, fewer lives would have been saved. The logic was inescapable but also deeply uncomfortable, because it suggested that her suffering had been necessary, that pain could be justified by outcomes. "No," she said finally, "I wouldn't change it." But not because the suffering was good or necessary. The suffering was terrible, pointless, avoidable. What I wouldn't change is what came after. The refusal to accept that suffering as inevitable, the determination to find a better way. That's what mattered, not the pain, but the solution. The students nodded, but Caroline wasn't sure they really understood. How could they? They lived in a world that the solutions had created, a world where rubber gloves were standard equipment, where chemical dermatitis among nurses was rare because proper protection was available. They couldn't see the darkness because they'd never experienced it. Dr. Chesney approached after the students had dispersed. "Thank you for coming, Mrs. Halstead. I think it helps them to understand that medical advances don't come from abstract research alone. Sometimes they come from very personal problems. Sometimes they come from being too stubborn to quit." Caroline corrected. "If I'd been more sensible, I would have resigned on my first day of chemical burn. The gloves only happened because I was stubborn enough to endure 3 months of suffering first." "Or brave enough," Dr. Chesney suggested.
stubbornness and bravery look remarkably similar from the outside. He gestured to the amphitheater, now empty except for them. We're teaching 500 medical students this year. Each of them will go on to treat thousands of patients over their careers. Every one of them will use rubber gloves, as a matter of course, never thinking twice about it. The innovation you helped create has become invisible through its own success. That's the highest achievement any medical advancement can reach. Caroline understood what he meant. The truly revolutionary innovations were the ones that became so standard that people forgot they hadn't always existed. Rubber gloves had reached that status. They were now as fundamental to surgery as scalpels and sutures. William, who had accompanied her to the lecture, took her hand as they left the amphitheater. His hands were steady despite his age, the hands of a surgeon who had performed thousands of operations, saved countless lives, transformed the practice of medicine. Those hands had also taken plaster casts of her ruined fingers, and refused to accept that nothing could be done. "Do you ever regret it?" Caroline asked him, "spending so much effort on one nurse's problem when you had so many other responsibilities?" William looked at her with the same intensity that had characterized their entire marriage. "Caroline, that one nurse's problem became one of the most important surgical innovations of the modern era. How could I possibly regret that? You couldn't have known it would work out that way." "No," he agreed, "but I knew you were worth the effort regardless of the outcome." That was enough. They walked through the halls of Johns Hopkins together, past operating theaters where surgeons worked with gloved hands, past nursing stations where staff prepared sterile equipment without fear of chemical burns, past the entire infrastructure of modern medicine that had been built on the foundation of small innovations like rubber gloves. Caroline thought about all the lives that had been saved, all the suffering that had been prevented, all the advances that had been made possible by the simple act of refusing to accept that her pain was inevitable. It had started with damaged hands and a desperate desire to continue doing work she loved. It had become something far larger than she could have imagined, and somewhere in the world, at that very moment, a surgeon was pulling on rubber gloves before entering an operating theater, never thinking about the nurse whose suffering had made that protection possible, and Caroline found that she didn't mind the anonymity at all, because the work was what mattered, not the recognition.
Dr. Robert Mitchell was a researcher who believed in the power of long-term data. In 1932, he undertook a study that no one had thought to conduct before, a comprehensive analysis of surgical outcomes across 5 decades, from 1880 to 1930, specifically tracking how the introduction of rubber gloves had impacted patient survival rates. The results took 3 years to compile and verify. Mitchell examined records from 47 hospitals across America and Europe, analyzing over 100,000 surgical cases. He controlled for advances in anesthesia, improvements in surgical technique, better understanding of anatomy, all the variables that had changed during that 50-year period. He wanted to isolate the specific impact of rubber gloves on patient outcomes. When he published his findings in 1935, the numbers were staggering enough that several medical journals initially refused to believe them, demanding additional verification. Mitchell provided it, and the conclusion remained unchanged. The introduction of rubber surgical gloves, combined with the more aggressive antiseptic protocols they enabled, had reduced surgical mortality rates by 67%. Before rubber gloves became standard practice in the late 1890s, approximately 1 in 3 patients died from post-surgical infections. After gloves became universal, that number dropped to fewer than 1 in 10. The impact was even more dramatic for certain types of surgery. Abdominal operations, which had been virtual death sentences in the 1880s with mortality rates exceeding 70%, now had survival rates above 80%. Orthopedic surgeries, which had often resulted in amputation due to infection, could now be performed with confidence that patients would keep their limbs. The data suggested that rubber gloves had, over the course of 40 years, saved approximately 20 million lives worldwide. 20 million. The number was so large it became almost meaningless, a statistic too vast to comprehend. Mitchell tried to break it down in ways that might resonate. 20 million lives meant 20 million families that weren't destroyed by the loss of a mother or father or child. It meant communities that continued because their members survived surgeries that would have killed them a generation earlier. It meant the continuation of work, of art, of all the human activities that required people to stay alive. Caroline read Mitchell's study in the library of her Baltimore home, William, sitting across from her reading the same text, both of them absorbing numbers that seemed impossible despite coming from rigorous research. 20 million, Caroline said quietly. That can't be right. The methodology is sound, William replied. I've reviewed it twice. Mitchell controlled for every variable I can think of. The number may actually be conservative. Caroline looked at her hands, now aged and arthritic but no longer damaged by chemicals. These hands, or rather the solution to their problem, had saved 20 million lives. The concept was too large to process. She'd spent her entire adult life in medicine, had nursed patients through illnesses, had assisted in hundreds of surgeries, had done her part to alleviate suffering where she could. She might have directly saved a few hundred lives through her work, but the indirect impact, the cascade effect of one innovation properly implemented, had reached a scale that seemed to belong in myths rather than medical statistics. I don't know what to do with this information, she admitted. William set down the journal. You don't have to do anything with it. The work is done. The innovation exists. It's saving lives every day without requiring any further action from us. But 20 million people are alive because my hands couldn't tolerate antiseptic chemicals. 20 million people are alive because you refused to simply quit when faced with an impossible situation, William corrected. Because I refused to accept that nothing could be done. Because Goodyear manufactured something that had never existed before. Because Bloodgood collected data proving it worked. Because military surgeons used gloves in field hospitals. Because teaching hospitals trained new generations of physicians in proper technique. It's not about your hands, Caroline. It's about what happened when the right problem met the right moment, met the right people willing to look for solutions. Mitchell's study was published in every major medical journal. It sparked discussions about how medical innovations were measured, how impact was calculated, how the ripple effects of single advances could extend far beyond their original scope. Some physicians argued that Mitchell had overestimated the impact of gloves, that he'd attributed too much of the improvement in surgical outcomes to one factor. Others defended his methodology, pointing out that he'd been conservative in his estimates, that the true number of lives saved might actually be higher. The debate raged through medical conferences and journal pages for years, but the core finding remained unchanged. Rubber surgical gloves, that simple solution to one nurse's chemical dermatitis, had fundamentally transformed surgery and saved millions of lives in the process. Caroline received letters from physicians and researchers wanting to interview her about the invention, wanting to document the history, wanting to understand how such a significant innovation had emerged from such a mundane problem. She declined most of. She didn't want to be memorialized, didn't want to be held up as some kind of hero when all she'd done was have damaged hands and refused to quit. The real hero, she believed, was William, who had seen a problem and refused to accept that nothing could be done. Or perhaps the real hero was the concept itself, the idea that personal suffering didn't have to be accepted as inevitable, that solutions were possible if people were willing to look for them. One letter she did answer came from a young medical student who wanted to know if she'd ever imagined the impact her invention would have. Caroline wrote back honestly, I never imagined saving 20 million lives. I only imagined saving my career, keeping my hands from hurting, continuing to do work that I loved. The larger impact was something that emerged from circumstances, from timing, from the willingness of others to adopt and spread the innovation. I cannot take credit for a cascade I never intended to create. All I can do is feel grateful that my small problem led to such a significant solution. Caroline Hampton Halstead died in 1922, at the age of 64, from complications of pneumonia. William followed her just 6 months later, unable to continue without the partner who had shared his life and work for over 30 years. They were buried together in a Baltimore cemetery, their graves marked with simple headstones that mentioned their contributions to medicine, but didn't capture the full scope of what they'd achieved. The rubber gloves outlived them both. By the time of Caroline's death, they had become so universal in surgical practice that most medical students didn't know there had ever been a time when surgeons operated without them. The innovation had become invisible through its own success, absorbed into the standard practices of medicine so completely that its revolutionary nature was forgotten. In the years following their deaths, Various medical historians attempted to document the story of surgical gloves. They interviewed surviving colleagues, reviewed hospital records, examined correspondence. What emerged was a picture of two people whose personal relationship had been inseparable from their professional collaboration, whose love for each other had been expressed through shared devotion to advancing medicine. William had created the gloves because he couldn't bear to lose Caroline. Caroline had stayed in medicine because William had shown her that her value was worth fighting for. Together they had accidentally revolutionized surgery, not through grand ambitions or visionary plans, but through the simple act of refusing to accept that a problem was unsolvable. The story became part of medical school curriculum, taught as an example of how innovations emerge from unexpected sources. Students learned about Caroline's dermatitis, about the plaster casts, about blood goods data, about the eventual universal adoption of rubber gloves, but the teaching often missed the human elements, the desperation and hope and love that had driven the actual events. It reduced a complex personal story to a simple narrative of problem and solution, cause and effect. What got lost was the uncertainty, the moment when Caroline had genuinely believed her career was over, the leap of faith it took for William to believe that a solution was possible. What got lost was the fact that they had been people, not historical figures, facing very human problems with very human emotions. In 1952, on the 100th anniversary of Caroline's birth, Johns Hopkins Hospital dedicated a plaque in her honor, placed in the surgical wing near the operating theaters where she had worked. The plaque commemorated her contribution to medicine and acknowledged that her innovation had saved countless lives. A small ceremony was held, attended by hospital administrators, senior physicians, and a few elderly nurses who had known Caroline in her final year. One of those nurses, a woman named Elizabeth Warner who had been mentored by Caroline in the early 1900s, spoke at the ceremony about what Caroline had been like as a person rather than as a historical figure. She described Caroline's sharp intelligence, her dry sense of humor, her absolute dedication to her patients and her profession. She talked about how Caroline had refused recognition for the gloves, insisting that William deserved all the credit, even though the innovation had emerged directly from her problem. "Mrs. Halstead once told me that she didn't invent rubber gloves," Elizabeth said. "She said she just had hands that hurt, and Dr. Halstead invented a solution. She was wrong about that. The gloves required both of them. They required her willingness to voice the problem, to refuse to simply quit. They required his willingness to listen, to believe a solution was possible, and they required both of them to be working in a moment when the technology existed, to create what was needed." Innovation is rarely about one person having one great idea. It's about problems and solutions meeting at the right moment with the right people. The plaque was unveiled, to polite applause. It hung in the surgical wing for decades, seen by thousands of medical students and patients and staff, most of whom walked past it without stopping to read the inscription. But some did stop, some did read, and some understood that the gloves they wore every day in operating theaters had a history, had emerged from real people facing real problems, had become universal through a combination of necessity and determination and luck. In the 1960s, a researcher named Dr. Tricia Morrison undertook an oral history project, interviewing surviving colleagues and family members of early medical pioneers. She tracked down Caroline and William's grandniece, a woman named Sarah Halstead, who had inherited boxes of personal correspondence and papers. In those papers, Morrison found letters between Caroline and William that revealed the depth of their partnership, the way they had supported and challenged and loved each other through decades of medical work. One letter, written by William to Caroline shortly after their marriage, contained a passage that Morrison later published in a medical history journal. "My dearest Caroline, you asked me yesterday why I fought so hard to keep you from resigning, why I went to such absurd lengths over a simple case of dermatitis. The answer is simple, though I struggled to voice it at the time. I fought because you represent everything I believe medicine should be: intelligence without arrogance, competence without callousness, dedication to the work without acceptance of unnecessary suffering. When I looked at your damaged hands, I didn't see just a nurse with a skin condition. I saw the cost of our protocols, the price we were asking people to pay for medical progress. If we couldn't find a way to protect the people doing this work, then our protocols were flawed, regardless of their effectiveness.
You gave me the problem that needed solving. I merely had the resources to look for a solution. Everything that came after, all the lives saved, all the advances made possible, those emerged from our partnership, from the combination of your determination and my refusal to accept defeat. I hope you never doubt your value, either to me personally or to the profession we both serve. Morrison published the letter with commentary about how medical innovation often emerged from intimate collaborations, from personal relationships that created space for honesty about problems and faith in solutions. The article sparked renewed interest in Caroline's story, led to several books and documentaries, ensured that her contribution would be remembered, beyond a plaque in a hospital hallway. But perhaps the best memorial to Caroline Hampton Halstead wasn't any plaque or article or documentary. It was the millions of people who walked through the world alive, because they'd survived surgeries that wouldn't have been possible without rubber gloves, people who never knew Caroline's name, never heard her story, but owed their existence to the cascade effect of one nurse's damaged hands, and one surgeon's refusal to accept that nothing could be done. They lived and loved and worked and had children who spread across the world, carrying forward the gift of life that Caroline had inadvertently given them. That was the real legacy, not fame or recognition, but life itself. Continue.
St. Mary's Hospital, Seattle, Washington, March 2024. Dr. Jennifer Park pulled on her surgical gloves with the unconscious efficiency of someone who had performed the action thousands of times. The gloves were nitrile rather than rubber now, hypoallergenic and powder-free, manufactured to tolerances that would have seemed like science fiction to Caroline Hampton. They fit perfectly, thin enough that Jennifer could feel the texture of surgical instruments through the material, textured enough that her grip remained secure, even when her hands were wet with blood. She didn't think about the history of the gloves. Why would she? They were just part of the uniform, as standard as the surgical mask or the sterile gown. Jennifer had never operated without gloves, had never imagined operating without them, couldn't conceive of a time when surgeons had worked with bare hands in open body cavities. The patient on the table had a ruptured abdominal aortic aneurysm, a condition that would have meant certain death a century earlier. Even 50 years ago, the survival rate for emergency AAA repair had been less than 50%. Now, with modern surgical techniques, advanced anesthesia, better post-operative care, and yes, the simple protection offered by surgical gloves that prevented infection, the survival rate exceeded 80%. Jennifer made her first incision with absolute confidence. The operating room around her was a marvel of modern technology. Monitors displayed the patient's vital signs in real time. Surgical robots waited on standby for the delicate vascular work ahead. The entire space was maintained at positive pressure to prevent airborne contamination. The air filtered and recirculated to ensure sterility. But the foundation of everything, the baseline requirement that made all the advanced technology possible, was the same principle that Caroline Hampton had struggled with in 1889: antisepsis, the prevention of infection, the maintenance of sterile conditions. Jennifer's gloves were part of a comprehensive system of infection control that included sterile draping, antibiotic prophylaxis, careful surgical technique, and post-operative monitoring. Remove any element of that system, and patient outcomes deteriorate. The gloves weren't the most high-tech piece of equipment in the room, weren't the most expensive or sophisticated, but they were absolutely essential. 4 hours later, the surgery was complete. The patient's aorta had been repaired, the aneurysm eliminated, the bleeding controlled. Jennifer stepped back from the table and carefully removed her gloves, disposing of them in a biohazard container. The gloves had protected her from the patient's blood, protected the patient from any contaminants on her hands, maintained the sterile field throughout the operation. They'd done their job perfectly, and she'd never once thought about them during the surgery because they'd simply worked. That evening, during a break between cases, Jennifer found herself in the hospital's medical library, researching something a patient had asked about earlier. Her search led her down an unexpected path, through articles about the history of surgery, past references to Joseph Lister and Louis Pasteur, until she stumbled across a paper about the introduction of rubber surgical gloves at Johns Hopkins Hospital. She read Caroline Hampton's story with growing fascination: the chemical dermatitis, the plaster casts, The first experimental uses of gloves in surgery, the initial resistance from older surgeons who believed gloves were weasoner, the data that eventually proved their effectiveness, the gradual acceptance until gloves became universal. Jennifer looked at her own hands, unmarked by chemicals, protected throughout her career by equipment that Caroline had helped bring into existence. She tried to imagine operating the way surgeons had in the 1880s, plunging bare hands into antiseptic solutions that destroyed skin, working through pain that never fully healed, accepting suffering as the price of practicing medicine. The thought was horrifying. The thought was also enlightening, because it made Jennifer realize how much of modern medicine rested on foundations that were invisible through their own success. She worked in an operating room full of advanced technology, but that technology only worked because basic principles of antisepsis and infection control had been established over a century ago. Caroline Hampton hadn't invented complex robots or advanced imaging systems. She'd just had a problem with chemical burns, and a surgeon who refused to accept that nothing could be done. That simple solution had made everything that followed possible. Jennifer pulled up hospital statistics on her computer. Mary's performed approximately 15,000 surgeries per year. The post-operative infection rate was 1.3%, well below the national average. A century ago, that infection rate would have been above 30%. The difference meant that roughly 4,000 patients per year at just her hospital survived surgeries that would have killed them in Caroline's era. Multiply that across every hospital in America, across the world, and the numbers became astronomical. Jennifer did rough calculations in her head, and came up with a figure that seemed impossible but was probably conservative. Surgical gloves, combined with the infection control practices they enabled, were currently saving approximately 50 million lives per year worldwide. 50 million every year. The cascade effect of one innovation, properly implemented and continuously improved, reached a scale that defied comprehension. Jennifer thought about Caroline Hampton, a nurse who had wanted nothing more than to stop her hands from hurting, whose personal problem had become a global solution. She thought about William Halsted, who had refused to lose a good nurse and ended up changing medicine forever. She thought about all the people between then and now who had refined the innovation, improved the materials, standardized the practices, trained new generations in proper technique. And she thought about the patient she'd operated on that morning, the man with the ruptured aortic aneurysm, who was now recovering in the ICU, whose survival had been made possible by a chain of innovations stretching back over a century. That patient didn't know Caroline Hampton's name, probably didn't know that surgical gloves had a history, didn't need to know, he just needed to survive, and the tools existed to give him that chance. Jennifer closed her laptop and headed back to the operating room. There were more surgeries scheduled, more lives to save, more work to do. She pulled on a fresh pair of gloves without thinking about it, because they were just part of the job, just part of the infrastructure of modern medicine that worked so well it had become invisible. And she got back to work in an operating theater that Caroline Hampton would barely recognize but would absolutely approve of.